Brandon Campbell, a respected local businessman, was found murdered in his home in Eugene, Oregon. The evidence soon pointed towards his wife, Laura, sparking a scandal that unraveled a complex web of lies, twisted love triangles, deceit, and dark secrets. Laura Campbell, a beautiful woman in her mid-30s, had always been the center of attention. Her previous marriage to Matthew Pierce had ended amicably, or so it seemed. Brandon, her current husband, had a strained relationship with his younger brother, Lucas Campbell. This strained dynamic hid deeper, more sinister connections that would soon come to light as the investigation unfolded. Brandon Campbell's murder was no straightforward case. It was the catalyst that exposed a convoluted love triangle, revealing that everyone involved had motives buried beneath layers of pretense and propriety. Detective Rachel Adams and her partner, Detective Mark Walker, would soon find themselves entangled in a case that defied simple explanations. The night of the murder, Laura's scream pierced the quiet neighborhood. First responders arrived at the Campbell residence to find Laura in a state of hysteria, her clothes stained with blood. Brandon's body lay sprawled on the living room floor, a deep gash across his throat, blood pooling around him, soaking into the carpet. The scene was chaotic, with furniture overturned and signs of a struggle evident. Officer Harris, the first on the scene, quickly secured the area. He observed Laura, who was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching a framed photo of her and Brandon. Her hands trembled as she tried to explain what had happened. "I found him like this. I came home and he was just lying there. I didn't know what to do." Her voice was shaky, her eyes wide with terror. But there was something in her demeanor that didn't quite add up. She was too composed, too rehearsed. Detective Rachel Adams arrived shortly after, her keen eyes taking in every detail. She noted the absence of forced entry and the fact that Brandon seemed to have been caught off guard, suggesting that he knew his attacker. Adams' gut instinct told her this was more than just a burglary gone wrong. As the forensic team began their work, Adams pulled Laura aside for a more detailed statement. Laura recounted her day carefully, avoiding eye contact. She claimed to have been out shopping and returned to find Brandon dead, but there were inconsistencies in her story, small details that didn't align. Detective Mark Walker joined Adams, his expression grim. He had spoken with neighbors who reported hearing raised voices earlier in the evening. None could identify the second voice, but it was clear that Brandon had not been alone before his death. Adams looked at Walker. "This isn't a simple case, Mark. There's more to this than meets the eye." Walker nodded in agreement. "Let's dig deeper. Something tells me we're only scratching the surface." The investigation into Brandon Campbell's murder kicked off in earnest. The following day, Detectives Adams and Walker began their meticulous process of gathering evidence and conducting interviews. The first step was to build a timeline of Brandon's final hours. They discovered that Brandon had left his office around 5 p.m., a bit earlier than usual. His assistant mentioned that he seemed preoccupied, almost distracted. Laura's account placed her at the local mall during this time, but there were no security camera records to confirm her presence. Detective Adams focused on Laura's behavior. She seemed cooperative, yet there was an underlying current of tension. During questioning, Laura maintained her story but frequently glanced at her phone as if expecting a message or call. Adams made a mental note to check her phone records. Meanwhile, Walker delved into Brandon's professional life. As a successful real estate developer, Brandon had made a few enemies. Business rivals and disgruntled former employees formed a list of potential suspects, but none seemed to have a motive strong enough for murder. As they dug deeper, the detectives learned more about Laura's past. Her previous marriage to Matthew Pierce had ended 5 years ago. The divorce had been amicable on paper, but whispers of infidelity and financial disputes lingered. Matthew had moved out of town but returned occasionally, supposedly to visit his daughter from another relationship. Detective Adams decided to pay Matthew a visit. He lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Eugene. Matthew was a tall, brooding man with rugged charm. He appeared genuinely shocked when Adams informed him of Brandon's murder. "Laura called me last night," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "She was hysterical, said Brandon was dead. I told her to call the police, and then I rushed over. But by the time I got there, the place was crawling with cops." Matthew's alibi was shaky, but there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Adams noted his reaction and decided to keep him under surveillance. Back at the station, Walker had uncovered a new lead. Lucas Campbell, Brandon's younger brother, had been seen arguing with Brandon several days before the murder. Lucas, a charming but aimless man, had always lived in his brother's shadow. He harbored deep resentment toward Brandon, fueled by jealousy and financial dependence. Lucas was brought in for questioning. He was visibly nervous, his eyes darting around the room as he spoke. "Brandon and I argued about money," he admitted. "He was going to cut me off, but I didn't kill him." The detectives were skeptical. Lucas's alibi for the night of the murder was weak. He claimed to have been at a bar, but no one could confirm his presence. As they continued to press him, Lucas's story began to unravel. Laura's suspicious behavior, Matthew's shaky alibi, and Lucas's deep-seated resentment formed a tangled web. The detectives realized they were dealing with more than just a crime of passion. There were layers of deceit and hidden motives that needed to be peeled back, one by one. Brandon and Laura Campbell appeared to be the quintessential suburban couple. They had a beautiful home, a successful business, and were well-liked in their community. But beneath the veneer of their perfect life, cracks were beginning to show. Brandon had built his real estate empire from the ground up. He was known for his business acumen and ruthless negotiating tactics. However, his professional success came at a personal cost. His demanding work schedule left little time for his marriage, creating a rift between him and Laura. Laura, on the other hand, had a more complex past. Raised in a wealthy family, she was accustomed to a life of privilege. Her first marriage to Matthew Pierce had been a whirlwind romance. Matthew was a charismatic entrepreneur, but his business ventures often ended in failure. Their relationship was passionate, but tumultuous, marked by frequent arguments and infidelity. The divorce had been bitter, with Laura accusing Matthew of cheating and financial mismanagement. Matthew, in turn, claimed that Laura's spending habits had driven him to the brink of bankruptcy. Despite the acrimony, they managed to part ways without too much public scandal. Matthew left town, but he never completely severed ties with Laura. Brandon entered Laura's life shortly after her divorce. He offered stability and security, something she desperately needed. Their courtship was swift, and they married within a year. However, the transition from a tumultuous relationship to a stable one was not easy for Laura. She missed the excitement and unpredictability that Matthew had brought into her life. Lucas Campbell, Brandon's younger brother, was another significant figure in the unfolding drama. Lucas had always been the black sheep of the family. He struggled with various addictions and had a string of failed business ventures. Brandon often bailed him out, creating a sense of dependency and resentment. Lucas's relationship with Laura was complex. They had an undeniable chemistry, and their interactions were often charged with unspoken tension. Laura confided in Lucas about her marital problems, and he, in turn, found solace in her company. It was clear to the detectives that there was more to their relationship than met the eye. As Adams and Walker dug deeper, they discovered that Brandon had recently made some significant financial moves. He had taken out a large life insurance policy and transferred substantial assets into Laura's name. These actions suggested that Brandon was either planning for the future or anticipating something dire. Laura's spending habits had also come under scrutiny. Despite her outward appearance of concern and grief, her bank records revealed large withdrawals and unexplained expenses. The detectives began to suspect that she might have been planning to leave Brandon and start a new life elsewhere. Matthew Pierce, though seemingly out of the picture, still harbored feelings for Laura. He had recently come back into town and had been seen meeting with her on several occasions. Their interactions were friendly on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of unresolved tension and unspoken words. The background checks painted a picture of a marriage on the brink, with each character hiding their true intentions behind a facade of normality. Brandon was the pillar of the community, Laura the perfect wife, Lucas the troubled brother, and Matthew, the ex-husband with lingering feelings. But as the detectives would soon discover, appearances could be deceiving. As the investigation progressed, the detectives focused on uncovering the motives behind Brandon Campbell's murder. Each of the main players had reasons, both hidden and overt, that could drive them to such an extreme act. Laura's financial troubles were the most glaring. Despite Brandon's success, their finances were drained. Laura's lavish lifestyle had put them in significant debt. The large life insurance policy Brandon had recently taken out added a sinister layer to this financial stress. If Laura were to benefit from Brandon's death, it would solve all her money problems. Laura's affair with Lucas complicated matters further. Their relationship was more than just a fleeting romance. It was a deeply emotional bond forged out of mutual dissatisfaction and dependency. Matthew Pierce also had a motive. His lingering feelings for Laura and the unresolved bitterness from their divorce created a volatile mix. Matthew's financial instability made him susceptible to desperate measures. His frequent visits to Laura hinted at a rekindled relationship that could have easily turned into a conspiracy against Brandon. Lucas's resentment towards his brother was well documented. He had lived in Brandon's shadow for most of his life, relying on him for financial support. The argument they had days before the murder centered on money and control. Brandon had threatened to cut Lucas off, a move that would leave him destitute. Lucas's dependence on Brandon created a deep-seated hatred that could have driven him to murder. The detectives also considered the possibility of a joint effort between Laura and Lucas. Their affair, coupled with their financial motives, made them prime suspects. If they conspired together, they could both benefit immensely from Brandon's death. Laura would gain financial freedom, and Lucas would rid himself of his brother's dominance. One evening, Detective Adams received a call from a local bartender who claimed to have seen Laura and Lucas together on the night of the murder. According to the bartender, they appeared to be in an intense conversation, their body language suggesting more than just a casual encounter. This new information put both Laura and Lucas at the scene of the crime around the estimated time of death. Adams and Walker brought Laura in for further questioning. Confronted with the bartender's testimony, Laura's composure began to crack. She admitted to meeting Lucas, but insisted they were discussing her troubled marriage and had nothing to do with Brandon's death. Lucas, on the other hand, was less forthcoming. When questioned about his whereabouts, he became defensive and evasive. His alibi, which had already been weak, now seemed even more questionable. The detectives pressed him on his relationship with Laura and the nature of their conversation that night, but Lucas stuck to his story of innocence. Matthew Pierce also remained a person of interest. His frequent visits to Laura, coupled with his financial troubles, made him a viable suspect. In the midst of these revelations, the detectives encountered several red herrings. One such distraction came in the form of an anonymous tip suggesting that Brandon was involved in illegal activities. The tip claimed that Brandon had been laundering money through his real estate business. While this lead initially seemed promising, further investigation revealed it to be unfounded. It appeared to be a deliberate attempt to divert the detectives' attention from the true motives behind the murder. Another false lead came from a disgruntled former employee of Brandon's. The employee had a history of making threats against Brandon and had been fired under contentious circumstances. However, after a thorough investigation, it became clear that he had no involvement in the murder. His threats were merely empty words, born out of frustration and resentment. The turning point came when Detective Walker discovered a series of text messages between Laura and Matthew. The messages revealed a rekindling of their romantic relationship and discussed plans to meet secretly. One message in particular stood out, sent on the day of the murder. "We need to act tonight. Brandon can't find out." Armed with this new evidence, Adams and Walker confronted Laura and Matthew separately. Laura broke down under the pressure, partially confessing to the affair but denying any involvement in the murder. Matthew, however, maintained his innocence, insisting that the messages were taken out of context. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Adams decided to take a closer look at the phone records and financial transactions. She believed that these would provide the concrete evidence needed to tie the suspects to the crime. The phone records revealed a flurry of calls and messages between Laura, Lucas, and Matthew in the days leading up to the murder. The communication pattern suggested a coordinated effort, with Laura at the center. On the night of the murder, there were several calls between Laura and Lucas, as well as a brief call to Matthew. This triangulation of communication placed all three suspects in contact during the critical hours. Adams also discovered an unusual transaction in Laura's bank account. A large sum of money had been transferred to an offshore account just days before Brandon's death. This transaction, combined with the life insurance policy, suggested that Laura was preparing for a significant change in her financial situation. Armed with this new evidence, the detectives decided to confront Laura once more. This time they presented her with the phone records and the financial transactions. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Laura's facade of innocence began to crumble. Laura's voice trembled as she spoke. "I didn't want it to come to this. I just wanted out. Brandon was controlling, suffocating. I needed a way out, but I never wanted him dead." Adams pressed further. "Who did you talk to that night, Laura? Why were you and Lucas in contact so frequently?" Laura hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "Lucas and I, we had a plan. We were going to leave Brandon and start fresh. but I swear, we never planned to kill him." The detectives knew they needed to hear Lucas's side of the story. When they brought him in for questioning, Lucas initially denied any involvement, but when confronted with the phone records and Laura's partial confession, his resolve weakened. Lucas admitted to meeting Laura on the night of the murder, but claimed their plan was only to confront Brandon, not to harm him. Laura had convinced him that Brandon would never let her go, and they needed to make him understand that their relationship was over. As the investigation continued, Matthew Pierce's involvement became clearer. The detectives reviewed his financial records and discovered he had received a substantial sum of money from an unknown source shortly after Brandon's death. This payment, coupled with the text messages, suggested that Matthew was part of the conspiracy. The detectives decided to bring all three suspects in together for a tense confrontation. In the interrogation room, they laid out all the evidence: the phone records, the financial transactions, and the witnesses' testimonies. Laura's breakdown, Lucas's nervousness, and Matthew's defiance created a volatile atmosphere. Detective Adams addressed them sternly. "We know about the affair. We know about the money. It's time to come clean. Who killed Brandon?" Tears streaming down her face, Laura finally confessed, "It was an accident. We confronted Brandon, things got heated, and Lucas lost control. He didn't mean to kill him." Lucas's face paled as he stammered. "It was self-defense. Brandon attacked me, and I just reacted. I didn't mean for it to end this way." Matthew, realizing the gravity of the situation, added, "I was supposed to help them disappear afterward. I never thought it would go this far." The detectives now had the pieces they needed. The confrontation between Laura, Lucas, and Brandon had turned violent, leading to Brandon's accidental death. In a panic, Laura and Lucas tried to cover up the crime, and Matthew stepped in to help them. The murder was a tragic result of a plan gone horribly wrong. With the confessions in hand, the detectives knew they had uncovered the truth. The case was far from simple, but the tangled motives and relationships had finally come to light. It was a web of love, betrayal, and desperation that had ultimately led to Brandon Campbell's death. The courtroom was packed as the trial of Laura, Lucas, and Matthew began. The community of Eugene, once known for its tranquility, was now a hub of media attention. Reporters and spectators alike were eager to hear the sordid details of the case that had shocked the town. The prosecution laid out a compelling narrative. They described how Laura's affair with Lucas had rekindled old passions, and how their relationship had become a desperate escape from her controlling marriage. The prosecution argued that the financial troubles and the life insurance policy created a powerful motive for murder. Laura's defense attorney tried to paint her as a victim of circumstances, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage who made poor decisions in a moment of panic. They emphasized that the murder was unplanned and that Laura had no intention of killing her husband. Lucas's defense focused on self-defense. They highlighted Brandon's aggressive behavior and his attack on Lucas, arguing that Lucas had acted out of fear for his life. They portrayed him as a man pushed to his breaking point by years of familial tension and resentment. Matthew's defense was the most straightforward. They claimed he had no prior knowledge of the murder plan and that his involvement was limited to helping Laura out of misguided loyalty. He was depicted as an unwitting accomplice, caught up in a situation beyond his control. Throughout the trial, the detectives' meticulous work came to light. The phone records, financial transactions, and confessions all painted a vivid picture of the events leading up to Brandon's death. The jury listened intently as both the prosecution and defense presented their cases. On the stand, Laura was a picture of remorse. She recounted the night of the murder in vivid detail, her voice breaking as she described the confrontation with Brandon. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke of her regret and fear. "I loved Brandon," she said, her voice trembling, "but I felt trapped. When Lucas and I confronted him, everything spiraled out of control. I never wanted this to happen." Lucas's testimony was equally emotional. He described years of living in Brandon's shadow, the constant feeling of inadequacy, and the moment of terror when Brandon attacked him. "I just wanted to protect myself," he said, his voice cracking. "I never meant to kill him. It was an accident." Matthew, in his testimony, admitted to helping Laura cover up the murder, but insisted he had no part in the actual killing. "I made a terrible mistake," he said. "I thought I was helping a friend, but I realize now how wrong I was." The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. They emphasized the premeditation involved in the affair and the financial motives. They argued that while the murder might not have been meticulously planned, It was the result of a series of deliberate actions taken by Laura and Lucas. The defense's closing arguments focused on the emotional and psychological aspects of the case. They pleaded for leniency, highlighting the lack of premeditation and the complex web of emotions that led to the tragic event. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Laura and Lucas were found guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging the crime's emotional context, but also the gravity of their actions. Matthew was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact, his role in the cover-up undeniable, but his involvement in the murder itself less clear. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom was silent. Laura Campbell was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Lucas Campbell received a 15-year sentence. Matthew Pierce, though less directly involved, was sentenced to 5 years for his role in the cover-up. The twisted love triangle that led to Brandon Campbell's murder had unraveled, but its impact would be felt for years to come. The truth, once uncovered, had brought justice, but it had also revealed the depths of human frailty and the devastating consequences of unchecked desires.